Let's make our first baby step into creating materials, setting up a scene, and doing a preview rendering. First, you want to make sure you always have cycles as the render engine selected. Then the next step, go to the world settings, open surface. You should actually see then this background and this white input. In case you see, for example, a button, use nodes, click it and you will see this. And then we would like to replace this white background color with an image. So we can click on this button here to the right, select environment texture, and we can actually then open an environment image. So, but what is an environment image? So let's go to the web for a second. If you type in, for example, free HDRI, let's take a look. All this are actually so-called environment images. So you see that they are kind of stretched panoramic images. And what the software will do, it will actually use those images and then wrap them kind of like 360-degree around your world. And then everything that's bright is emitting light. Everything that's dark, let's say black, obviously doesn't emit any light. And then the color of each pixel in the image decides actually also the color of the light this emits. So this means, for example, in a situation like here, you mainly get kind of like greenish bounce lights from the ground and bluish light from the top because of the sky. If we go to, for example, let's say something like this, there isn't really any strong clear light source, so everything will be more illuminated, kind of like in a diffuse looking way. But then if, for example, we select maybe something like this, where you have very clear white areas, you will see actually in your rendering that it seems a lot of the light actually comes down from the top. And when you go to DeviantArt by this guy, he actually offers a pretty nice set of different so-called HDRI images. And let's go to his website at DeviantArt. And there you see it again, different sets of images. They all simulate, for example, in this case, a studio lighting. Because essentially in digital rendering, we have to simplify the way how we do something in real life, because also our computers aren't as strong as needed to really physically accurate to compute light physics. So everything what we do in digital rendering is a little bit borrowed by the way how things work in nature, but simplified. So for example, I actually like this set because this looks like there is a gray backdrop, and then I have some light umbrellas that emit, for example, the diffuse light, and then I can just download this one. Let's go to the first one and maybe select it as well. Okay, then let's unzip it and take a look at what we get. Because you will get two files. You will get actually a JPEG preview. This is just more or less a small image every computer can open, so you can see maybe what's inside the HDRI file. HDR stands actually for high dynamic range. To really explain this, I might have to go a little bit more in detail, but to simplify it, think about like everything that's JPEG has 4 tones of gray. And when you have something that's called HDRI, you have 10 tones of gray, so you have more color tones. Now imagine you have to illuminate an environment with 4 tones of light, or maybe with 10 tones. So obviously the more tones you have, the more precisely and detail-oriented you can illuminate an environment. Which is why you never want to use actually JPEG images for the so-called image-based lighting. I think if you press on the Mac, when you press spacebar, it will load actually a preview, and there you can see it how this one, for example, looks. Okay, so let's go back to Blender. So inside this environment texture, we have to load this HDRI file. So I can click open. Then I go to downloads. Here's, for example, this pack. I can see a preview by clicking on this icon. And then actually it also inside Blender shows you a preview of the content of each HDRI file. And I will select this one and click open. Okay, you don't really see anything inside the 3D view, but we can actually show this world image in the background. So we go to display, we turn world background on, and now everything looks kind of grayish. And you see actually I'm currently in orthographic view, but to see a three-dimensional image projected like a sphere around our scene, we have to go into perspective mode. So I press 5 on the numpad, and then when I rotate around, you actually can see that this flat image is now wrapped around a sphere, and actually all the perspective distortion of the image is gone. Okay, perfect. So what else can we do? For example, here we have a setting for strength, and maybe let's turn on the first rendering. So for example, for the view, we could switch maybe to make something like crazy fisheye lens-wise. So you see this looks very very distorted. We have a 10mm lens. Or for example, when we go to 100, you see this still 3D perspective, but the perspective distortion isn't as strong. Actually, as a small suggestion, if you want to play around things, I find it might work everything between kind of like 35, 40 to maybe 120 is okay. The higher the number, the flatter, so the more orthographic the image will look like, and the smaller the number, the more crazy distorted everything will look like. So maybe I will go with a 55. Okay, perfect. Good. So this is actually currently not a rendering. This is just the OpenGL real-time preview, and we can turn on the rendering by clicking on rendered. And there it is. And you see actually the way how this engine works. It starts very coarse and then step by step starts to clean things up a little bit more. And when I rotate around, you can actually see that, for example, the sides get a little bit more light. The back less, because that's actually where the backdrop is. Okay. If, for example, your camera stops at 10 here, we could go to the camera, and then we can go to sampling, and for example, inside preview, let's say we type in 100. And you will see this will continue counting, which means every time it cleans the image one sample further. So at one point, for example, the image will be perfectly clean, so noise-free. If we set this one to 3, our images always will look like this. Which maybe if you work on a weak computer or you don't want to render constantly is actually okay, because this, for example, could already give me somewhat an okay feeling of how maybe my scene might turn out. If we go back to the world and, for example, play with the strength setting, strength setting, crazy th always is hard for me to pronounce. We can, for example, type in 0.5, and you see now we dim everything down. If we set it to 0, it's totally black. If we set it to 10, it's totally washed out, so way too much light. Maybe at the moment for a first setting, which we can maybe keep this at, I don't know, 0.5 seems to be good. So you might ask yourself, so how do I know what to put in here? Well, this is actually all based on what you try to do. and also how much light, so bright areas, for example, your background image provides to you. And the value of 1 currently seems to be kind of dim. There's not really much contrast. So when I type in 0.5, this actually feels a little bit better illuminated. Okay, so that's kind of like how we set up our basic world environment. And the next step, then we will apply a glass material to the bottle. So let's take a look at how we can turn this bluish object into glass. Let's select the glass bottle. You also see always down here what object you have selected. So if you name your objects accordingly and you click around, you will always get a readout what object you currently have selected. So this button here is only for creating the material for the world, but we want to create a material for this object. So we click on this icon here. That is the icon to see all the materials for objects. And currently what we see is we use a modeling material. 3 objects actually use this material, which means when I change this color or anything, those other 3 objects will be updated at the same time. I would like to create a completely new material. So I click on this minus. So you see now this is white, kind of like a default material. Then I click on new. For example, we can turn this one into glass. So I give it the name. And then I go to surface, and to make this one to look like glass, well, yep, you guessed it right, we simply select glass. And there it is. We can, for example, play with the roughness a little bit. So maybe what happens if this one is 0.5, then this is more like a frosted glass. So what the software tries to do is it roughens up the surface. Not really, it actually simply changes the way how light rays hit the surface. And then you all know, like for example, if you put your hand into water, under the water surface, your hand seems to have a different angle than the rest of your arm that's above the surface. So kind of like this effect, this think about the software tries to do a little bit. And for example, with a reflection, you know, if, for example, a light ray hits a surface, when the surface is polished, so it's reflective, then the light ray bounces off in a nice direction. And when the surface, for example, is sandblasted, those reflection rays jump into all different directions, hence giving you this diffused look of a blurry reflection. And this is, for example, something the roughness can help us with. And if we set this one back to 0, then this is basically treated like the surface is nice and smooth. The light, kind of like water, goes through the bottle, is bent, and the reflections on the surface are also nice and clear. We can change, for example, the color if you want to. There are also other settings which I will go into detail at a later point. So maybe let's keep it at this for the moment. Okay, so let's take a look at where's my cap. So here's my cap. Okay, I have to turn off actually this Boolean command. This is actually also a good moment to introduce the function of this icon here. So this actually means I do not see this Boolean command in my 3D view, but it will show up when I do an actual image rendering. If I don't want to see both, I simply deselect it. Okay, so this object, for example, we would like to make reflective. So it has to be glossy. So let's think about like chrome. That's a metal, the surface is polished, so this, the reflection is nice and clear. Also here, we can remove all these materials, new, and let's say we call this one chrome. And then this should look glossy, and so I always just select glossy and then press Shift Z to turn on the rendering. And let's take a look. And there it is. And you see when we rotate around our view, we can actually see the environment showing up inside the reflection. Also here, to simulate, for example, a sandblasted metal surface or scratched surface or such, we can work with the roughness. So instead of just really roughening up physically the surface, what sandblasting, for example, will do, we simply add, if you want to think about it this way, we simply, instead of having the light ray hitting a surface and then exiting the same with the same angle and direction it hit the surface, just scatter them around. Because then that actually will make something that looks nice and clean, reflection-wise, to look more blurred and fuzzy. And this will actually then give you the feeling of, well, this is actually, let's say, a sandblasted surface. Also with materials, for example, with metal, we can change the color of the reflection. So you see it's not just the metal that changes, but also the color of the reflection is tinted. And also here there are multiple options, and I will go into detail in later assignments. But maybe for the moment, let's keep this one maybe at this. And this one I would like to be 0.8, 0.8, 0.8. Oh, actually I could click, drag, and then select all three at once. Okay, nice. So let's take a look at the insert here. I will move this one onto a different layer so it will be visible. And let's maybe turn on the rendering. Okay. So let's say this should be clear silicone. So silicone, for example, could be very clear. Let's say we want to have silicone that is a little bit translucent. So you can see that light goes through the object and illuminates the volume. Think about it when it's dark, you take a light, put it in behind your hand, and you see that the light illuminates actually your flash. So the light rays actually go really through your skin and your flash, and they do not bounce off. So to get this translucent effect, well, we could simply, for example, give this material a translucent effect. So I move this one up and click new, and for example I take this one off as well. Let's call this one, what I'm doing, hold on. So you be gone, and where is this one material? There. And let's call this one silicone. So it should be translucent. And well, we just then select translucent. And when we start the rendering, what you will see actually is that the way what the software tries to simulate is how actually light would illuminate the volume inside. And if you really pay attention to, for example, those upper corners along the threading, everything looks a little bit fuzzy or soft. So the translucent material does not, for example, like a diffuse material, have very sharp corners or shadows. So if we switch this to diffuse, there you will see now this is much more contrast rich, and also the shadows inside the threading are much more pronounced. But this also looks like the light hits the surface and bounces off. And when we work with something that's translucent, it feels more like, obviously some light bounces off, but also a lot of the light rays actually go into the surface and illuminate the volume. Now I kept actually this one cut because I would like to show you now how we could add a material for a cut section. So I just add another material slot, And then like before, I select Boolean. And you see also then in render time that, for example, works out. So all the objects that create actually those cut surfaces will apply their Boolean material, which is a diffuse orange, onto the insert, and then the rest will get the silicone material. And that's kind of like, for the moment, the first introduction into the different material systems. So you see, you actually pick a material based on what you need. It has to be glossy, well, it's glossy. It has to be glass, which is kind of like a combination of transparent and glossy, including bending light. Well, you use glass. It just has to be a matte surface. Then you could just select diffuse. For example, it should emit light. Well, it has to be an emission material. And there are also other materials or types we will introduce at a later point. So after having all this covered, let's actually take a look at how we could, for example, select this Illy logo and apply it kind of like as a sticker onto the cap of our bottle. First thing what's really important is, as you can see in my preview, the background is transparent and just the logo, so everything I want to see, is opaque. That's very important, and you will see why. And the way how we create a material also is a little bit similar to the way how we would work with layers and layer masks inside Photoshop. So let's go to Blender and let's go to the layer where we have our cap. I shift click onto another layer. So I will work on this layer, click on the cap, and for example, I could shift S cursor to selected, shift A plane, and then go to the tool panel, type in 1 centimeter. For example, move this one up. Let's go into orthographic view back and take a look. Oh, I moved it along X and Y, so let's correct it. Edit mode, and I scale this a little bit up. So that's roughly the way how actually the actual product is, because some of the lower text is wrapped over those kind of chamfered sides of my cap. Okay, perfect. Let's also be proper and name this one cap texture, or for example label. Good. Let's go to material, click new. Whoops, spelling. Let's call this one cap texture. And again, always try to use proper names that make sense to you, because even like with the modifiers, this will help a lot at one point when you have to find objects or know actually what an object is. Because if you go to a list, for example here, and let's say we have a Boolean operation and everything here reads like plain 001, 002, you have really no idea actually what's going on. So let's go to the top view, and then we will do the following. So I will actually, not this, I will move this one down so we make a horizontal cut, and then up here I will do a vertical cut. Okay, and then in here I will load the node editor, and here I will load the UV editor. Perfect. Okay, all good. Let's go back to perspective view. We can move this one a little bit closer there. Okay, so let's click on the cap label, go to material, and you see down here we read environment texture, background, world output. So this is actually the node for our world. I would like to see the nodes for this label object. To do this, simply down here switch from displaying the world attributes, display the object attributes, and there it is. And you see actually that the nodes are nothing else than kind of like a mind map visualization of how, for example, everything will be later stacked inside this list view. So everything what you do in material we would do here at the same time. It's just those are two different ways how to present all these different functions or building blocks. So for example, if I change this one to red, you see this is red. If I change this one to blue, this one is blue. Okay, so we have this texture and we would like to project this texture onto, or better, we would like to map this texture over this rectangle. And you would say, well, okay, we just have to load the texture and then glue it over this mesh. Well, so how do we actually load the texture? So here's the add button, or you could also press Shift A, and we have to load the texture. So we need to add a function that allows us to load a texture, and that is texture, image texture. Click. And you see this one looks actually very similar to the environment texture inside the world. Pretty much the same. Okay, so let's go to open and let's take a look. Where's our logo? There is the logo. Open. Okay, let's do a rendering. Well, object is blue. So why doesn't this work? Well, the thing is we just have this texture added as a function, but we don't really tell the software how to use this image. And you see their outputs and their input fields. And you see they're actually all ultra colored. So we have gray, we have yellow, we have green, we have blue. And yes, we can simply drag this one into this field, which is basically then means is the blue color will be overwritten by the content of this image. We take a look on the right side. It's black. Well, why isn't this image showing up? So the problem is simply, well, we have a computer mesh, but how should Blender, and actually that's a problem with every software, how should a software understand how you want to use a texture and then glue it over the mesh? Now in real life, if we have a sticker, we take it with our two hands, go to the back of our car, position it, press it against the car body, and the sticker is glued onto our car. The software doesn't really understand how to do that, so we need to somehow tell it to do it. And to do that, we have to establish, for example, an X and Y coordinate system for a mesh, which is 2D, and then apply the texture to that. Sounds odd or confusing, but let's try this one out. It's actually very logical. So inside the UV and image editor, we can click on this image icon here, and there is the logo. Let's open it. And there you see actually everything that's opaque and everything that's transparent. And when we click our label, let's go into edit mode. You see I have everything selected, and then you can press T. Ooh, this field is very compressed. Let's go to there. Let's go to shading and UVs. And for example, there under UV, think about UV as the meaning of X and Y, so a two-dimensional graph. And it says UV mapping, unwrap. Let's simply select unwrap. And now you see actually our mesh showed up here. Okay, so did anything change? Let's go to rendered. And hey, there's our image. Perfect. So what does actually this mean that we unwrap the mesh? So we took basically this rectangular mesh. Think about you take a cloth iron and you wrinkle everything, all folds, you make everything flat. So we flattened actually this rectangular mesh, and well, it was already flat, so that function went pretty well. And you see this is also the same shape like our mesh here, but they are not really linked. But this point is this point, and then this point up here is this point. So if, for example, I move this point, pay attention to what happens in my rendering. You see now I basically distort the layout or the shape of this rectangle, and then everything that's inside my UV editors inside this face will be stretched over this rectangular layout. So why is that important? So let's go back, AA and U and unwrap. For example, I can select everything, also proportionally scale it down. You see then at least the texture will not be stretched, but the smaller I make this image here, you see the less pixels are actually inside this area. So the coarser actually the rendering will look, because the small amount of coarse pixels will be then stretched over this bigger surface to fill it. And that's basically UV unwrapping and texture mapping in a nutshell. You have to create a coordinate system so that the software knows here's my mesh, and whatever is texture-wise under each face, apply my 3D model to each face. So far, so good. The problem we currently see is that while in our image the background is transparent, here it is not. So why is it that way? So let me introduce you to know why actually this node system is such a fantastic tool to work with, because you can visually see how all these different functions or building blocks influence each other. So currently how this material works is we load an image, and then we take the color of that image and put it into the color of a diffused material. And then the end result of the diffused material with this texture, we actually send to the material output for our surface. Now I would like this to be transparent, so we need, in purple you guessed it, a transparency function. So we can go Shift A, go to shader and say transparent there, and let's drag this one to there. But the problem is, well, no, the object is transparent. So what could we do? Well, we have to somehow mix these two things together. So for example, where something remains opaque and where something is transparent. So we need to mix. So we need a mix function. Because you see, we can only apply actually once one material into the surface output. So we go to Shift A, Mix Shader. And you see, I can actually drag it and place it onto this line. This will highlight it, left mouse button click, and it adds it. And then I can drag this one to there as well. And you can see now that our label is actually transparent. But at the same time, you see also the texture from the diffuse material. And if we adjust the slider, now factor 1 means 100% transparent, no diffuse. This means 50-50 roughly. And this means 100% diffuse and nothing from the transparent model. So the slider is okay to fully adjust a mixing between these two materials, but that's not really what we want. We want to, where stuff is transparent, use this material. Where stuff is solid, use this material. And like in Photoshop, we will create a layer mask, which is a black and white image that describes where something is visible and where not. And we have this actually somewhat because we have the function for the transparency inside this image, and you see the image texture reads out the color and alpha is equal the transparency, and you see this is grayish, so we can connect this. And there you see now that the surrounding transparent area is opaque and the opaque area is transparent. So how could we fix this? Well, easy fix, we flip the order of the material. So you see you can left mouse button, click, drag, and it changes it. For example, that works. We can also inverse actually this alpha image. So what we have to do is to add an inverse function. So Shift A, and so we're working now with the colors of this image, and we go to Shift A, color, invert, and drag it onto there. And then here with the slider, we can step by step, you see, adjust the factor, how much, for example, now everything will be inverted. And there. So, pretty awesome so far. And let's say now we would like to project actually this logo onto the cap. So let's actually go back into object mode, turn off the rendering, go to modifier, and we have to project this one down. So we can use the shrink wrap. Select the cap as our object. Let's call this one cap. There. And we use project along the z-axis. But you see z arrow points up, so that's positive. We want to go a negative. Okay. So doesn't really bend. Well, the thing is, those 4 points will be used to project onto the cap. And there are no points in between for the mesh to deform, so we have to add extra points. However, I don't want to go into edit mode, select everything and say subdivide and subdivide and subdivide, because now I have so many points I have to work with. We can do something smarter. We go to modifier, subdivision surface, move this one up. You see now actually this changes the result. There's just project it down and then reround this result. If, for example, we move the subsurface up first, we can subdivide it. So it actually, as you can see, adds more point into actively. And then this result we project down. But I don't really want to change the proportion of the square. I just want to add more horizontal and vertical subdivisions, which instead of using Cutmole Clark, we simply use simple. And there you see the difference. So pretty nice. I want a really good result. So this is a very simple object. So in this case here, really I can go to 6 and then go to the project, show this one. Because I do not apply any Boolean modifier to this label, I really can just go with a high number for the subdivision. And in case this would not be enough, then maybe a one level subdivision I have to do manually, and then the amount of faces will be even doubled. But for what we're going to do, this will be perfectly sufficient. So this all looks pretty good, you would say, but there's one slight issue. We really projected this mesh onto the cap, which means if the math is doing its job right, the surfaces occupy the same space. But if we print something on an object, the ink sits on top of the surface. If it's a label, the label sits on top. So we have to move this label just a fraction up. So if we, for example, start a rendering, you see kind of interesting stuff like this. So if we go to offset and maybe, let's say 0.01. Oh, way too much. So 0.001. Better. Still too big. So one more. Okay, this is getting better. And you see it doesn't really touch it. Maybe one more. This is, for example, too close. You see there are artifacts, so maybe instead of 1 we go half the amount back. And yeah, this is actually not too bad, but I see here some issues. So okay, let's go this way. Perfect. Now if we zoom out from a distance, everything looks very good. And if we zoom in very much, you will see, hey, what's going on here? There's a shadow. So obviously there we can see that, particularly here, you can see that actually it's floating on top. So it's kind of fake. But again, when we see something like this from a distance, this is actually a totally doable and perfect process. And then if, for example, this has to be really very tight and it has to be match nicely, so if we want to project this one even closer, then we also have to go to this object and, for example, increase the subdivision. So if I go to view 3, you can see that this is kind of like a little bit faceted. With 4, this is softer, but it's still faceted. So the project modifier will have an easier way to better place actually that mesh over the cap. And with 5, but interestingly, I maintain having these issues here. So I guess, by the way, you also see this is kind of like, looks like it's tessellated or so. The mesh currently is shaded flat. We want to shade this one nice and soft and round like this one, so we can select this object, go to edit mode, select everything, shading and smooth. Hold on. Whoop, there, faces. Click the wrong one, so flat and smooth, and there it is. Okay, but I think this didn't really fix that issue, so let's take a look. Yeah, so I guess what we're trying to do here, we might have to do a little compromise. And also this is, for example, something where we could render everything out very tight and where we have small issues. Either in Photoshop we clean it, or for example we make a spot rendering of this area without the label, and then in Photoshop we just glue these two parts together. Obviously, you should want to set up your scenes in a way so you do not have much work to do later in Photoshop, but at the same time, you have to ask yourself, where can you get something done faster and better? And if it's actually, for example, in this case, re-rendering without the logo, before I spend finding values that really match, I probably might simply render two images with the label, without the label, and then in Photoshop, copy and paste and compose those two renderings together. So we're reaching somewhat the end actually of our first exploration into creating kind of like layered materials or node materials. And currently this label is very flat. Maybe I would like this label actually also to be reflective. So think about maybe this Illy, etc. Everything is printed on paper, and then we will put a clear coat or film over it. So we need to have a glossy film over it. So we need to add a glossy function. So let's go shader and glossy. But then again, how do we use this one? We have to mix these two things together. So also there, shader, mix. Let's maybe say what happens if we do this. So we have our the end result of our diffuse and transparent. object mixed, for example, with this reflective one. Not really very good. Doesn't look very the way how it should be. So, but actually we have the correct objects, but we simply have the wrong order. So, take a look at this one. So you can take Control, hold it, and then we cut these lines apart. And I move this one to there, and I move this one to here. This one I move away, I move it to there, and I plug this one in. So let's take a look at how this one actually just looks like. So as you can see, it's a mix of the diffuse and a mix of a reflective surface. And maybe what I also would like to do is change how reflective a surface is based on my view angle. So right now, for example, this is very nearly tangent. This is more perpendicular, and maybe on perpendicular I would like to see less of the reflectivity, and tangent I would like to see more than reflectivity. So I need to add a function that mixes these two materials based on the kind of like the view angle, and we can do this with Shift A, and then we go to layer weight. Actually, hold on, let's do one other thing first. So we use the Fresnel. Move this one to there, plug it in, and just pay attention. You see, the more I go up, the more diffuse it will be, because it shows more the diffuse material, and the more I go down, the more of the glossy material will come in. And Fresnel is a French guy who observed actually this effect that when you look at a window, you can see through it. If you look tangent to a glass surface, you see a reflection on it. And Fresnel, that's also the way how it's named this way. This function simulates mathematically this behavior, but sometimes this has some issues with certain flat surfaces, which is why very often we actually use this layer weight. And you see it also has a Fresnel and a facing, and actually facing is really interesting to work with. So basically I could say don't really blend anything, or maybe blend more of the glossy part to it. So you see it's all glossy. And if I set this one to 0.2, for example, it will look actually very similar to the Fresnel effect. And there you see that looks more diffuse, and this looks more reflective. Okay. So you might ask yourself, well, this sounds crazy. Okay, let me explain this again. So this facing function basically tells you to change how two materials might be mixed together based on the angle. And then with the blend, think about how much we can override actually this effect. So for example, with 0.2, we most of the time will see more of the diffuse, but based on the view angle, a little bit of the glossy will be shown or subtracted. And this is also a reason why it's very good to have many objects in real life you can take a look at, because nothing is harder than building material if you don't have a reference object. Okay, so let's bring this one to an end. So how do we make now the rest transparent? Well, we could actually, how could we do this? Well, this output actually shows this, and we would like to get the outside transparent. So to this output, we have to mix in our transparent. And then this alpha value we use in this case now at the end for the factor. And there it is. Very easy. So you see, what do we do as a recap? So we added an image. The image texture will be used for a diffuse material. We added a glossy material, and then based on the view angle, we mix these two materials together. Now the completely solid output we put into another mix material and mix it with a transparent material, and let's decide, or let the transparency of the original image decide when to show what. So when to show the end result of the diffuse glossy mix and when to show the transparent result. And then that end result is being fed into the material output. So that's the reason why actually you have to follow certain steps, because kind of like the way how maybe step by step the software can calculate all these material properties, and then we are presented with an already pretty nice looking rendering of our metal cap with a somewhat transparent, somewhat reflective label on top. So as an end, let's goof around. Let's say, well, no, I would like maybe this not to be an opaque material. Maybe this should simulate kind of like the liquid ink, transparent ink, sorry, that was printed onto the cap. So this end result we have to make transparent, because we need the metal to show to shine or show through. So we can easily do this by adding another mix function. So this end result of this transparent surrounding and the solid diffuse material, Shift D, add another mixer, and then we do not have to add another transparent function. We can simply recycle its output and put it in there, and then you see if we make this one 0, well, we see exactly this output. If we go to 1, we only see this transparent function, but if we turn this one into 0.75, 0.5 or 0.25, we kind of like mix this opaque together with this transparent and then give you the illusion of actually maybe this whole thing being a little bit, yeah, transparent. So you see the power actually of the node system. Before I mentioned, you can really nicely see the flow, how all these functions work. But the power of the node system is also that you can recycle and reuse objects and really generate very interesting steps how shaders with material properties and images are mixed and calculated together to create kind of like the material or effect you're looking for. Obviously, this is just really scratching on the surface. There's so much more to it. For example, this metal we can turn also into brushed aluminum, so we can add horizontal brush marks, etc. to it. And all those parts, for example, I will step by step, as again, introduce in the following projects.